Hi, this is Talking Torah and Tzedek, a project of Uri L'Tzedek. I'm Judry Subar. I'm here with Rabbi Herzl Hefter. Rav Herzl, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon here in Israel.
Okay.
But it's good. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. So Rabbi Hefter is the Rosh Beit Midrash of Midrash Har'el.
Beit Midrash Har'el, yeah.
Beit Midrash Har'el. Rav Herzl, could you put yourself and Beit Midrash Har'el on the map, if you will, by describing what it's all about?
Well, Beit Midrash Har'el is the first and only, to this date, the only Orthodox Beit Midrash that gives smicha to men and women together. And we've done this since 2015. We have 10 full-time fellows who are studying with us right now. What we believe in, we're not about giving smicha to women per se. We believe in projecting the future into the present. Namely, we believe that we have to do what we believe without being afraid. The fear that people may have stems, I feel, from a lack of trust in the Torah. And I think that when we go down to what we believe is right, and through consultation with other people that we have deep respect for, and we come to the conclusion that there are certain things we need to do, then we need to do them. And this is based on, for me personally, on theology which is firmly rooted in Chassidut and tradition, where God reveals himself to us continuously through ourselves, through our healthy intuitions, when they are checked in collaboration with others and with halacha and tradition. Based on that, we did what we did and we do what we do.
Great. It sounds like what you and your institution are all about is, as you say, merging the future and the present in some fashion in a meaningful, productive way. One phrase that I might use to describe that, although I'd like your perspective on this, is social justice work. Is that a phrase that resonates?
Yes, it's very interesting to put social justice work in context of Chassidic thought, because it's not, in Hebrew you say it's not muvan me'elav, it's not a given, because the Chassidic move, you could say, was a move towards interiority, towards the interior spiritual world of the individual, as opposed to ritual, which is done in community. The focus moved away from that, and that naturally can sort of de-emphasize social issues or social justice issues or nationalism issues. And that's actually why there's some tension between traditional Zionist thought and Chassidut, where the Zionists, I sound a little bit like a Satmar Chassid when I say this, because the Tzionim, right, the Zionists, right, what they wanted to do was change the stage of history for the Jewish people. And what the emphasis of Chassidut is to change the interior life of a person. So that could put them at odds, right? But of course, the danger that Zionism faces is being so involved with the exterior world that there's a neglect of the interior. And I think we see that sort of as a problem in Zionism, whether it's left-wing or right-wing. It's maybe even more pronounced in right-wing Zionism, where everything becomes Eretz Yisrael. So people like Buber, they saw, you could say, Chassidic spiritualism as an antidote to the exterior focus that Zionism has. And they wanted to see Zionism, like the spiritual side of Zionism, being the engine of of Zionism. The spiritual engine should be Hasidic spirituality. So that's just putting in context of like how I live here in Israel. But I think there is a tremendous amount of room to talk about social justice in terms of Hasidic thought, because there's a danger, I say danger, quote unquote, for that when we begin to talk about social justice or tikkun olam or morality, there's a danger that we reduce religion to morality and social justice, where that becomes everything. And what we stand to lose is the entire numinous or sacred aspect of religion in that, where the most important thing is to do the right thing and to promote the right types of policies as we understand them. Right. So there's a danger there. But I think that correct understanding of the potential that Hasidic thought has can really be very fruitful. And that would be, I would say as follows, that all religion, not just Hasidut, but religiosity seeks meaning in life, and it seeks transcendence. In other words, that people through introspection come to a place where there's more to reality than just them. And they feel a connection to something outside of them. That, I believe, is the core of the religious sentiment. And that, of course, is amplified by Chassidut, by such sayings that Rav Tzadok Lublin always used to say, that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah which are parallel to the 600,000 who left Egypt, which means that every individual is a letter in the Sefer Torah. Now, he's based on earlier sources. This is not the time to get into that. But what it means when you say that every individual is a letter in the Sefer Torah is that every person is a piece of divine revelation. God can only be revealed in the world through people. That's the first thing. And the second thing, which Rav Tzadok emphasizes, is that in the metaphor, if there's one letter missing from the Sefer Torah, then the Sefer Torah is pasul. If there's one letter missing from the scroll, then the entire scroll is invalidated, which means that we're all in it together. That even though I may be a reflection of God in the world, but I myself, all by myself, cannot bring God into the world. I need everyone else. And we have to do it together. So, and that's the transcendence, that I feel I'm connected to everyone else. And that connection is based on Tselem Elokim, but not Tselem Elokim in a superficial way, but very deeply that God reveals himself in the world through not one individual, but through humanity. And that creates responsibility and empathy. And that's really the basis, I think, of morality and the work for social justice from a religious perspective. Well, because I sense that there's something much bigger than myself that connects me to other people in a profound way, that creates a sense of responsibility and activism to promote that sort of togetherness and to be concerned for the welfare of others. Rav Simcha Bunim of Pshischa was known to say that if you want to evaluate someone's level of fear of heaven, then see how they fulfill the mitzvah of you should love your neighbor as yourself.
That's great. When you talk about responsibility for others and the importance of each individual, but also the importance of understanding and remembering that it's not just a matter of our working in the world, but it's a matter of our being in touch with our spirituality as well. One thing that occurs to me is Abraham Joshua Heschel's comment that when he was marching in Selma, Alabama, he felt like I think the phrase was, he was praying with his legs. what do you see as the connection between what Rav Simcha Bunim was saying and what Heschel was saying?
I think he's saying that, first of all, the real test, there's a real danger, actually. Here's another hazard. When you talk about things that are very valuable, the stakes are always very high. So if there's a hazard that we face when you talk about interior spirituality, is that we become narcissistic and we care. It becomes sort of idolatrous when what we're seeking, but we don't recognize it as idolatrous because we don't want money and we don't want power, but what we're looking for is a religious experience, right? And that becomes an end in itself, and it can become very self-involved and narcissistic. So one of the ways of protecting ourselves from that is to know that that our yirat shamayim, our fear of heaven, is connected with other people, right? It's connected with v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. So how do you know that your religiosity is not just worshiping yourself? If it expresses itself in your legs, right? Not just in your heart and your mind, but actually in your legs, right? And that's actually, there's a distinction in Chassidut between different schools. Like Chabad is Chachma Bina Dat, is intellectual Chassidut, but Polish Chassidut is known as the Chassidut of Chagat, of Chesed Gvur Teferet. It's like the Chassidut of emotions and actions. So I have a preference for Polish Chassidut. I'm not putting down Chabad theologically, but my preference is for Polish Chassidut, where the measure of your perfection is in your actions.
It's interesting because I think if you would ask the person on the street, if you will, as long as you're talking about the right street where people even would understand this question, if you would say, which is the more out there in the world type of Chassidut today, Chabad or what you're referring to as Polish Chassidut, I think a lot of people would say it's Chabad because that's who we see out there in non-Chassidic communities,
right,
doing stuff.
I don't want to get into like a sociology of Chassidut today. I'm talking about what the theology. It's not necessarily doesn't necessarily correlate with the sociological reality the way we see it today.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. So to talk about sociological realities and to kind of reify this, if you will, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how some of what you're talking about relates to issues on the street. We'll start with issues that are front and center when COVID allows them to be, I suppose, in Israel today. There's certainly issues in Israel relating to interreligious dialogue between Jews and Muslims, for sure. And there are issues that I don't want this to get overly political, but there's certainly issues relating to the political relationships between Jews and non-Jews in Israel. I'm wondering how what you're talking about relates to those issues.
Well, I think that it's very important to be honest. And all sources and movements can be read in different ways by different people. Because if you want to take a more universalistic approach and say that, an intellectual approach, an approach of reason is universal. So because 2 + 2 = 4, whether you're a Muslim or a Jew or you're a Palestinian or an Israeli, right? 2 + 2 = 4. So there are certain ways of looking at things which are universal. And so if you take a rationalist approach, then you're going to be universal. But the general wisdom is if you take a mystical approach, you're going to be very particular because things, quote unquote, don't need to make sense. They just need to make sense to me, right? And I don't have to justify them to you. So that it makes them very subjective. And once that happens, it becomes very, very dangerous, right? So you, of course, do have very problematic pronouncements in Kabbalistic literature and in Chassidic literature regarding non-Jews. You also have other types of pronouncements because it's not consistent. Just like Chazal, our sages of the Talmud, were not consistent. The sages of the Kabbalistic tradition is not consistent because there's more than one person and there's more than one continent. So there are a lot of different views which are stated. But I just want to put it out there that if someone is looking for very disturbing pronouncements, they will find them in Chassidic literature. At the same time, I think that there's potential that if you base your worldview beginning with the inside, in other words, beginning with introspection and feeling a sense of what makes you what you are, and what the ground of your identity is. And if you find there your Tselem Elokim, and if you find the presence of God in your heart, which is where, according to Chassidic theology, where God rests and where he's primarily found not in history and not in cosmology. He's found in your experience. But if you take that and you generalize it, say, if my experience is this way, if this is my feeling of godliness inside of me, then by extension, you have that in you, right? And then the question is, so that's all for Jews, right? Then how does that relate to people who are not Jews and don't share your belief system? So here really becomes a question of whether you view revelation or God's revelation to individuals as something which is miraculous or something sort of natural, whether you take sort of a naturalistic view of revelation. And here I'm actually going towards Maimonides, but here's where Maimonides and Hasidism meet, where the view is that God made the world a certain way, that he's revealed naturally through human beings, and to the extent to which that revelation occurs is the extent to which human beings perfect themselves. Going back to the metaphor earlier, to what extent you polish up your own letter in your own Torah scroll, right? How much you make your own letter shine. So to the extent that revelation is universal, so then is natural, then I can see it as a universal phenomena, which also can express itself, which does express itself in people who are not Jewish. And there are sources like that as well. So I prefer to emphasize those sources rather than the sources that I think are problematic. Now if it was just me, so then here it is, it's just subjective and anything goes. But this is a question of who you collaborate with and how honest you are with yourself and how you feel things need to move forward in an authentic way.
So I guess
so that's how I think of. That's when I think of how we relate to people who are not like us, people who we might be in conflict with. This doesn't solve, the conflict that we have with the Palestinians, or it doesn't solve that, but it can, from our perspective, set the stage for a fruitful way of interacting. Of course, it takes two to tango, and we can't be naive. But that's
okay. So I guess taking the metaphor that you've been talking about and running with it just a little bit further, I suppose one way of looking at it is to ask whether the question is, when there are 600,000 letters in the Torah, does that mean it's 600,000 capped and it's just ours, or 600,000 is itself a metaphor for infinity, maybe?
All right, so that's open to interpretation, right? What they might have been thinking is they were thinking about Jews, right? When Reb Tzadok quotes that, he's thinking about Jews, right? But when you say 600,000, So he's aware, here I'll give you the metaphor doesn't actually hold, and that opens up possibility, right? But this is what I'm saying. It's not Rav Tzedek. I want to be honest, right? Rav Tzedek says, Rav Tzedek was a bit of a genius. So he said, and we know there aren't 600,000 letters in the Torah. There are actually closer to 300,000 letters in the Torah. He must have counted them, right? Or he knew it off the top of his head. But he said, but we know that some letters are comprised of other letters, like a chet is two zayins, and a tzadi is a nun, and a yud, right? So and he said, and it doesn't matter, because the idea is that everyone is a piece of the Torah. So now 600,000 is only males between 20 and 50. So you can get more specific if you like, and you can get picky uni and say, well, maybe it's only men between 20 and 50 are a letter in the Sefer Torah. So it obviously doesn't mean that. It means, he gives an acronym for how to remember this saying that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah. So Yisrael is the acronym. Yisrael is Yesh Shishim Ribo Otiot La Torah. The word Yisrael stands for there are 600,000 letters in the Torah. Now, so obviously he's not just talking about men. He's not talking about men between 20 and 50. He's talking about all of Israel. So that already is not taking that saying literally. So then the question is, how much, based on other considerations, you're going to extend this in terms of creating an attitude.
Okay. So we've been talking about intergroup relationships in Israel. I'd like to shift the focus a little bit to intergroup relationships in the United States, where I am. And I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that we're experiencing here in the United States a major moment of discussion and action relating to the place of race and racism in the history of the United States and its present and its future. And I'm wondering if you can comment on what lessons the United States might have to learn from one or both of the following sources: from the thought within the Chassidic world, the Chassidic movement, and or the slice of Israeli society represented by Beit Midrash Har'el.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I don't have pretensions to be a commentator on the situation in America or to be a commentator on the situation in Israel. But it just seems to me, look, I grew up in America. You can tell from my English, I'm from Brooklyn. Yeah. And even though I've been living here for more than 40 years, but I still feel connected to the United States. And I feel very indebted to the United States for taking my parents when they came to America after the Shoah. And I grew up in America. And so I have only gratitude towards the United States. So it really pains me to see the situation. And when I think about it, it seems to me that it's as if the Civil War never really ended. And with the military defeat of the South, and maybe it was dormant for a while, and then it came up. So it's always beneath the surface. And I think perhaps the reason for that is that there was never a cheshbon nefesh. There was never a spiritual and a moral taking stock of what actually happened, what the slave trade did to blacks, the injustices that were perpetrated. There was a fear of that. Maybe people wanted to put it behind them and just move forward. But I think because I'm involved in Chassidut, so people often ask, how is Chassidut? Is it similar to Buddhism? Is the very interior? So one major difference that I have, again, I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but one major difference that I've detected, Buddhism is about letting disturbing thoughts go. Let them wash past you. And I feel that's very not Jewish. I'm not criticizing it. It's an observation that I have. psychoanalysis is much more Jewish than Buddhism, in the sense that you have to come to grips with what was. You can't just put it behind you, or to quote Lion King, put your past behind you, right? You can't just put it behind you. You have to turn back and confront it and grapple with it. Now, that's always risky, because you may feel it's going to consume you, because you want to go to a better place. You're only going to go to that better place if you can successfully come to terms with what was, and then use it as leverage. Use that experience of grappling with what was as leverage to move forward in an authentic way. And that's the only way wounds can heal. I don't think it's too late, but I think there really has to be open acknowledgement in American society, like what happened. Because the great-great-grandchildren are still alive, and they carry, trauma, passes through generations. My parents were Nitzilei Shoah, but I'm sure I know that my kids are affected by what they went through, because it affected me, and it affects me as a parent, right? So, and it affects them, and in ways which they don't really know.
To make sure that all of our listeners understand what you're talking about, you referred to your parents as survivors of the Holocaust.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So my parents survived the Holocaust. They were clearly traumatized by what happened. That trauma certainly went over to the second generation. And in a sense, it could be more noxious in the second generation, because everybody knew that the people who went through it were traumatized. But I grew up in New York, so what trauma did I have? Right? But it does affect me, and it affects my children. So you don't have to compare and rate the different traumas, right? But clearly, being abducted from Africa and hauled over to the New World was traumatic on the most fundamental level, and that trauma gets transferred over many generations, and it has to be addressed. It has to be addressed for everyone's sake.
Okay.
The Germans, at least nationally, they did tshuva. They educate against anti-Semitism. Like they did, I think, the best that could be done. So I don't know if America ever did that. And it's very important for healing and to be able to move forward. And I think that when they do that, the moving forward is a better place, even though it could be felt to be very dangerous and threatening. But I think they have to work on creating a safe space, and that would be demanding from, the victims have to help provide that safe space for the healing to take effect. But it seems to me that never happened in America. That's what I mean when I say the Civil War never ended.
Okay. So you referred to, in the context that you were just discussing, the importance of cheshbon nefesh, of a taking stock. Wondering if we could just wrap up with your addressing the following point. The world really has faced some difficult months over the last several months. Is there some positivity that we can get out of the experience by doing some sort of global cheshbon nefesh, taking stock, do you think?
Well, I think, look, first of all, I'm hesitant to learn lessons from current events, because we don't understand yet the ramifications of what people have gone through, how big this event is, whether they'll be looking back in 100 years from now and they'll be saying before Corona and after Corona or not. So I'm a little, just in all fairness, I'm a little hesitant because everyone talks about the things that we learned from Corona. But that said, I would say that the lesson that we learn is we're taught what is more essential and what's less essential. What do we really, really need? And what don't we need all the time? And I think that that's a very important lesson. What's essential? Families are essential. Being together is essential. caring for other people is essential, because if we don't care for other people, then many people are going to die and we're in threat. So I would say interdependence is something that we learn. We don't control everything, right? I think that's why people are panicking. People are panicking because we're taught that technology has all the answers, and it doesn't. There's still things we don't control. We do our best to control what we control, and I'm not happy that there's a plague to remind us that we don't control. But I think of, when King David did this, counted the people, and he wasn't supposed to count the people in the book of Samuel. And as punishment, the prophet comes to him and gives him a choice. Do you prefer plague or war? So he says, I prefer plague because I'd rather be in God's hands than in human hands. So in a sense, we're in God's hands, and it's a terrible way to realize that. But I think that we can take away some lessons of what it is to be in God's hands, that we need each other, and that we have to come to terms with what is humanly possible and free ourselves from the illusion that we can do everything, and that we really are dependent one upon the other, and that's really an essential reality.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Thank you very much for having this conversation.
Thank you very much, Judry. It was a pleasure.
Great.